Hello and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. This week we thought we'd speak to some of our own journalists at Land and Climate Review, Camille Corcoran and Bertie Harrison-Broninski, and delve into their recent investigations into the UK headquartered power company, Drax Group. Drax has attracted media and political criticism in recent years, as it is not only the UK's single biggest carbon emitter, but it is also the single biggest burner of wood pellets in the world, sourcing much of its wood from forests in the US and Canada. Previously a coal-fired power station, Drax has converted to burning wood and has positioned the use of bioenergy, or biomass burning, as a renewable and climate-friendly energy option for the UK government in reaching its net zero targets. It has also controversially been a large recipient of UK government subsidies in doing so, receiving more than £7 billion, or $9 billion, in government subsidies since 2012. As some listeners may already know, the UK's use of wood burning for energy is partly down to a UN climate accounting loophole, which has allowed successive UK governments not to count the wood burning in their own carbon budgets and to instead treat the process as zero emitting. Drax is now pushing for an extension to its UK subsidies, which end in 2027, and it is also pushing for subsidy to add carbon capture to its UK biomass plant, which it claims will support UK climate targets by creating negative emissions. Meanwhile, many environmentalists and scientists have warned that the wood pellet business is driving the degradation of forests worldwide, and that carbon dioxide emissions from the UK power plant are actually even more carbon intensive than when it burned coal instead of wood. Even the Energy Secretary from the UK's previous Conservative government has now come out against wood burning for energy, in her words saying, "We cannot go green by burning trees at huge cost to the public."
We found that in total, since 2014, Drax had violated environmental rules over 11,000 times. The majority of the violations related to air pollution, but some also related to breaches of water regulations.
I began by asking Camille and Bertie to outline the findings of their investigations.
Mainly what we've looked at this year has been pellet mills. So these are industrial facilities that turn wood from forests into little tiny balls of wood dust, which are then shipped to other countries to be burned in power stations instead of coal. And we've looked into this mainly in a UK context because the UK has a large ex-coal power station. It used to be the largest coal power station in the UK. It's now the largest power station of any kind in the UK. And that gets a lot of subsidies from UK bill payers in order to burn wood, which is considered green officially, but that's quite contentious. What we've done is document all of the environmental crimes at pellet mills in the UK supply chain and look at some of the plans that the company that runs this power station, Drax, has got in the US for further expansion. We started doing that really because we've been doing this podcast and other stuff for about 3 years, but only looking at investigations really in-house for about a year. And in the autumn of 2023, we were scoping out which topics to look into and thought we'd probably do something around bioenergy because we'd already covered that quite well. But there hadn't really been major focus on the pollution impact of the pellet mills in the UK supply chain, although there had been lots of other investigations looking into which forests they source from and that kind of thing. And I had a look to see if there was official reporting of the pollution impact from the Canadian mills and couldn't find all of them. So I emailed the Canadian Environmental Department just to ask for some of these reports if they existed, presuming it was my error that I couldn't find them. And got a reply back saying that Drax had missed their reporting deadline for a mill in Alberta. And this was actually the most recent mill that they had acquired. And that could land them with a fine of up to 500,000 Canadian dollars. So that was the first little bit of story that we did. And from there, it kind of grew. A colleague, JSIM, found a database full of inspection reports of these Canadian mills that contained many, many more violations. And we started going through those in some detail, working out exactly how many violations were in each of these reports. And these are, when I say violation, I mean times when the pellet mills were out of compliance with their permits, mostly air permits. And we got to a very big number in the end. We got to 189 as a conservative figure since these mills had started exporting wood pellets to the UK. And these were mostly pollution breaches, so going over the limit that was set by the Environmental Department of British Columbia or Alberta for specific quantities of specific pollutants or not reporting things properly or not keeping paperwork on site or keeping record of things. And then also some other kinds of environmental breach, including draining wetlands was quite a severe one in Alberta, polluting waterways, and many other kinds of offence.
I think I should bring in Camille into this as well, and maybe also what the final findings are. I mean, I think Bertie's kind of summarised it in Canada to understand that there are quite a lot of air pollution violations, some water ones. I mean, maybe we can go through the impacts of those afterwards.
Yeah, given Bertie and Jason's findings about violations in Canada, we thought it would be worth looking into the compliance with environmental regulations of Drax's pellet mills in the US, because we were aware that they also kind of own and operate 7 pellet mills there across the US Southeast in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana and Arkansas. So sort of went through a similar process of starting to dig into documents put together by state regulators in those 4 states. These kind of range from inspection reports as well as compliance orders from state regulators. And we found that in total, since 2014, Drax had violated environmental rules over 11,000 times. The majority of the violations related to air pollution, but some also related to breaches of water regulations.
11,000 times, that seems like a large number, but it's probably important to compare Canada and the US, or at least to say so. So Bertie, in your investigation, the number of breaches that you found was a lot lower.
There are quite a few differences between the methodologies and regulatory regimes in these 2 investigations, so they can't be directly compared, those numbers, really. One of the differences is that Camille was able to rely more on actual rulings of the regulators, times they'd already decided they were violations. In the Canadian side of things, a lot of what we recorded were inspectors recording things. So we had to make the judgment about what counted as one violation ourselves in many cases, and we tried to be very conservative with that. In lots of these cases, we could have chosen to count every day that something continued as another violation, or even every hour in some cases. We didn't do that in general. We just, for most of these things, we went with the lowest number that we thought sensible, because we didn't want to be, we didn't want to over-exaggerate any of our findings. I think, though, there are trends between both investigations that are about repeated emissions breaches, bypassing pollution controls, many other things.
Yeah, I think one of the differences with the US violations is that particularly in Louisiana and Alabama, I was able to use documents that had been put together based on Drax's own submissions of compliance data, in which they kind of set out all the times that they operated outside of their permit limits. These are called deviations. And the state regulators, so in Louisiana, with the Louisiana Department for Environmental Quality, every year or so will go through these documents and assess what within them should count as a violation of environmental law, and then put together these kind of compliance orders, which they then share with the company and say, having amalgamated all of the information you've given us, we find that you've breached emission limits this many times over this time period. So those documents were helped to get quite a precise figure, at least in some states, for the number of times that Drax were breaching environmental laws. In other states, for example, in Mississippi, it was a bit more of a case of making judgment calls ourselves in the same way as Bertie had to do for the Canada investigation, because the documents are slightly harder to access and you don't have as many available that set out their methods of operations in such detail.
And should say as well that Camille managed to estimate over 3,000 very recent deviations that are likely to become violations. So there's a projection, I guess, of future penalties that could be quite big in the US. And I'd say the kind of summary of that in many ways is just there is a lot more data in some of these US states than there is in a couple of the other US states, and certainly in British Columbia or Alberta, there just isn't that level of data available. You're relying much more on provincial environmental department officials just visiting once every year or two and looking at what records Drax has kept on site, which often they weren't able to find, and seeing what happens on the day that they visit. as opposed to this continual data monitoring that you get in some US states that allows us to get these thousands and thousands of violations.
I want really to know what these violations mean and what we should make of them.
We'd heard a little bit in Mississippi and British Columbia that locals were upset about the pollution from these mills. Just to say a little bit about British Columbia, the context there is that these pellet mills were introduced in the 2010s and sold to the local residents as a means of reducing certain types of pollution from wildfires. When there's a wildfire, you get a lot of what's called particulate matter in the air. It's this kind of tiny, tiny, tiny bits of wood dust that are quite harmful to human health when they're breathed in. And part of the risk for wildfires as well is the fact that so much residue wood and leftover wood from logging is piled up and often burned in the open. What the pellet mills proposed to do was to take all of that waste wood and process that and contain it all safely and reduce the wildfire risk and reduce this open burning that's going on all the time anyway, which is also bad for local air pollution.
So the pellet mills themselves have been presented to communities as a kind of solution to this particulate matter going into the atmosphere as a result of wildfire burning. We'll solve this by having these pellet mills here, and we'll reduce the levels of particulate matter. I mean, that's the understanding.
That's the understanding. They reduce the risk of wildfire. They reduce the open burning anyway, which is also bad for pollution. And instead, they have all these pollution controls and they process everything in a regulated way. But of course, they're not following those regulations. So that hasn't really applied, and it has upset people quite a lot.
Yeah, in the US, there's a range of violations. I mentioned a lot of them relate to air quality. The majority of them do. The most serious ones relate to kind of breaching permitted limits of certain pollutants. So those are generally volatile organic compounds, VOCs, or hazardous air pollutants. Experts have described them to us as kind of the most dangerous pollutants that are regulated under the Clean Air Act in the US. Examples include formaldehyde, acrolein, substances that are carcinogenic or can cause kind of serious respiratory issues and eye, nose and throat irritation. Similarly to that, there are instances where there's certain control technologies that are specifically designed to limit emissions are bypassed or just not used at all. At one of the mills in Louisiana, the La Salle mill, the bypassing was happening in this facility almost the equivalent of once a day, which experts have told us absolutely not acceptable and not how these facilities should be run and these technologies should be being used.
We spoke to numerous environmental attorneys, some of whom had worked on cases about pollution at pellet mills in the US before, and they were all quite shocked at the scale of the figures that you put together for that piece. These are the same trends that you see in the Canadian ones about bypassing pollution controls.
One thing I was interested in as you're talking about the kind of the levels of breaches, the air pollution, what role have the public authorities had in this? So there are fines for this. And then if you could maybe explain this, but then is there any action in terms of the public health authorities? Or you might expect in certain countries that public health authorities or local government or even national governments might intervene at a stage where you have quite high levels of air pollution in a community or close to a community.
So for these violations, there have been fines. Since 2019, Drax have been fined just over $6 million for various violations across its pellet mills. That's 8 separate penalty notices, but that figure only actually covers about a quarter of the total number of violations we've found. So the experts we've spoken to, some of the fines, the individual fines total to over $2 million, but that's not seen as a substantial cost for the company and it's something they can absorb into their sort of business model. There seems to be an inadequacy in that regulatory regime in that sense. There's also seems to be a discrepancy in how often inspections are carried out in different states in the US Southeast and in how regularly kind of desk reviews of compliance information are conducted. So some of the fines, I'd say also some of the fines that have been issued to Drax, particularly I think in Mississippi, have also, as well as being financial penalty, they've also required them to install certain pollution control technologies in the mills as well. which Drax have done, but then continue to be violations in the years that follow the installation of these technologies. So there are definitely questions about how effective regulatory systems are in the US Southeast, at least.
But then the public health authorities, I mean, have they played a role in this? Because, or in terms of when breaches are found, are there any efforts to limit exposure to the local community?
Not that I'm aware of, but there is this review by the EPA, is it, in the US that's just started.
That's the Environmental Protection Agency.
Which we haven't looked into in a lot of detail, but it's been talked about by some of the academics that look at this issue as quite a relatively big deal, I think. In Canada, I'm not aware of any kind of health element. I mean, the environmental laws that exist are designed to prevent that. And when you go on the pollution reporting sites, either the federal one in Canada or the local ones, there are lots of links to the different types of pollutant that are regulated through these air permits and the different health impacts of those pollutants, but no real follow-up beyond penalties and some amendments to permits like Camille talked about in BC. So it's a similar situation. The main difference in Canada from what Camille was saying is, again, just the numbers are a lot smaller. There are actually 12 fines that we found in our Canadian investigation, so more than in the US. But unlike the $6 million figure in the US, you're looking at maximum fines of about 40,000 Canadian dollars. Under environmental law in British Columbia, it seems like these penalties are actually capped at between $10,000 and $75,000, depending on different things. So it's actually impossible to get fines of the kind of scale that you see in the US. And I doubt these have a huge impact on a company that just from the UK bill payer subsidies is getting £2 million a day. So yeah, I don't think that these are going very far into changing practices. Drax has said that they've improved things a lot at these mills. There are 9 mills in Canada that Drax now own, but many of those were acquired in 2021 and 22, so they haven't had them as long.
One thing in the US is that earlier this year, several quite senior US senators introduced the Forest Biomass Emissions Act of 2024 to Congress. So quite high-profile US politicians like Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker were involved in this legislation, and it is seeking to kind of study the impact of this industry on local communities that live kind of very close by to pellet mills and other biomass facilities. What will happen to that legislation now is up in the air, but it shows that at least at a federal level, there is interest in addressing some of the issues around this.
With all this, it's worth asking what kind of pressures there are in terms of any change around these environmental breaches and pollution violations, etc. And maybe you could take us through a little bit of the detail of the impacts on people's health, if there were any associated impacts that were found or alleged.
Yeah, well, beyond the higher level legislative pressures that Camille was talking about that are beginning in the US, if not perhaps in Canada, there's a continued and pretty notable pressure from activists and residents in these places. In British Columbia, there have been local community campaigns for a long time around this issue. Clean Air, Bulkley Valley in British Columbia near the town of Smithers was a group that we talked to quite a bit. And that goes back for several years that they've been trying to do air monitoring in towns and talk to doctors about what the health links might be. In Mississippi, there's quite an active community group called Greater Greener Gloucester. And this consists of residents of the town of Gloucester, which has a pellet mill owned by Drax on the edge of it, quite near to residential homes. And these people are suffering from a variety of health conditions, and they believe that those have been catalyzed or perhaps even caused by the pollution from this mill. And that includes chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lots of breathing conditions, from asthma through to more severe things like even kinds of cancer. And they've been going to the Mississippi state capitol and doing protests and speeches and trying to talk to the press as often as they can, and trying to talk with Drax as well and the mayor of the town to get something changed around what they see as this massive health risk all the time for them.
The work of Greater Greener Gloucester, I think, has been noticed not only by state regulators, but also by communities that where wood pellet mills might be, or that industry, the biomass industry, might be looking to move into. We've found that Drax are currently looking to expand their wood pellet business in the US. particularly by setting up a new pellet mill in Washington State in Longview, which is on the Columbia River there. It's been met by a lot of kind of opposition from the local community there, who see this as potentially damaging industry for the area. And they look to the work of Greater Greener Gloucester, in particular, as evidence of how harmful for communities these sorts of facilities can be.
And some of these stories are quite upsetting. I mean, you can read them in more detail in our interviews in the articles, but they include a woman called Sheila that we spoke to in Gloucester, who has to have oxygen attached to her pretty much at all times, walks around her house with this long cord to breathe from. And several of her family members have had similar health problems. Her husband passed away from similar health conditions, sadly. And in British Columbia, we spoke to people that had to move home to different parts of Canada because they were so scared about the pollution from this mill. The residents see these issues and their fears around them as having changed their life in quite dramatic ways.
And what kind of response do you think there should be to all this?
There are different levels of issues here. At a kind of more structural level, I think there is a question about the social license. In both of those two case studies I just mentioned, so Smithers in British Columbia and Gloucester in Mississippi, one of the things that the locals feel so angry about is the fact that they feel like they were misled about the project that was built and run within their town. So I think there's an issue here about locals giving consent for something and then something totally different happening. And that's quite a difficult thing to address. It is quite systemic, but that's certainly something we highlight.
Does that go back to what you were saying about the wildfire and particulate matter?
Yeah, there are documents from community meetings between the companies. It's not actually Drax at this point. In the 2010s, it's a different company before Drax bought it, but that company promising very explicitly that they would see significant drops in air pollution once the mill was operating. And of course, that hasn't happened. I mean, whether or not air quality has gone down in the area is quite complicated, but the mill itself has repeatedly broken air pollution rules because it's emitting such high levels of dangerous pollutants. So it's clearly not been helpful to local air pollution. And in Mississippi, I mean, people we spoke to were saying that they'd been promised that it would hire a lot more locals than they think it was, than they think it ended up doing, and that they hadn't been made fully aware of the health risks from the pollution and other issues. I think another thing is clearly, like Camille said, and we talked about earlier, just that these fines, even the larger ones in the US, aren't doing enough to mitigate reoffending or recurrence of these issues. Most of the categories of air violation that we found are repeated over and over and over again in the same places, year to year, often month to month. Some violations, they continued every day for like over a year. So clearly the system of penalties is not effective in deterrence.
And is it worth saying then that these kinds of breaches then are not actually specific to a company like Drax? It just so happened that you found these issues with Drax, but I mean, it could extend to other bioenergy companies.
Yeah, I think it seems that there is a problem with the wood pellet industry in general. When we spoke to experts about these figures, sort of asked how they compared to other wood pellet facilities they'd looked at, and we're told that, you know, these numbers are likely to be similar with other such facilities. Experts told us that the number of breaches we'd found at Drax's mills in the US kind of put them on par with chemical refineries and oil distilleries in terms of the number of breaches. I think that they were saying that kind of shows that even though these are facilities that we associate with renewable energy and clean energy, they have the capacity to be incredibly polluting in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
And that's the other question around all of this that hangs over this topic, I think, about whether or not you should subsidize this industry, and especially whether or not you should subsidize it as a green energy source. None of these pellet mills would probably be able to run at a profit without these UK subsidies, so that you can't disentangle that from it. And those subsidies do have sustainability criteria that are linked to following the law in other countries, although perhaps not quite in such a way that they're disqualified by our findings.
So it's maybe worth asking, how about the UK government, for example, which is arguably one of the biggest funders in the US and Canada?
Yeah, I certainly think you could strengthen the existing sustainability criteria for the UK subsidy regime quite dramatically, because it's not effective, and even the government auditor in the UK has said that the government isn't able to fully know what's going on in the supply chain, and that perhaps there's a question beyond that of whether or not these subsidies make any sense to begin with. Increasingly, people from all political stripes and contexts take issue with them. Many scientists have criticised them. I know that at the moment, the UK government is yet to decide about 2 further subsidy decisions for Drax, as the current contract ends in 2027. And just to pick up what Camille was saying about what differentiates Drax from other companies, it really is scale at the moment. It's not necessarily any of these particular practices, which I think pretty much all of the things that we've found, you could find an example of another pellet mill doing similar things, or another facility within the forestry or energy industry doing similar things. But Drax is pretty much still an outlier in the fact that it is the global leader at the moment in the bioenergy space, so at least in the woody power bioenergy space. There are other big wood pellet companies, but Enviva, the largest one, has gone bankrupt this year. There hasn't yet been the growth in big biomass power stations at Drax's scale, although there's a clear threat of that happening, and there are lots of early signs. But at the minute, Drax is the largest biomass power station. It's receiving the most green subsidies for doing this, and it owns the supply chain that it sources from as well, especially in the UK, but even internationally is a focus of a lot of these things. It is a trendsetter. So reforms to Drax's supply chain would likely have knock-on impacts for the whole world.
I think it's probably important to set out here what Drax's response was to your investigations.
Drax have not challenged our numbers. So these figures that we've said about the scale of violations is acknowledged and recognised by Drax. They've said they need to do better, and that they are working on improving a lot of things that they have done in the past couple of years. And to be fair, in Canada, we did find that although many of these issues have continued, the peak of our data set is before, in many cases, or at least around the time that Drax acquired many of the mills. So it's possible that they are improving things there. Maybe a bit less clear in the US, where we've seen these deviation numbers suggesting there are going to be similar levels of violations in the next year. Drax did argue with a few of the more specific points we made in our articles, and a few of the things that our sources said. They dispute that the Mississippi residents' health impacts are caused by their facility. They said that an environmental consultant had found that there are no direct health impacts from their mill in Gloucester.
They've also stressed to us that they're investing significant amounts of money in improving compliance at their pellet mills. They said they've put, since 2022, £100 million into it, and that by the end of 2024, they'll invest another £30 million on additional improvements for their mills.
It's important to just read Drax's own statement for this, and this is for Drax spokesperson's response to Camille's latest piece, which appeared in the Times, around the 11,000 environmental violations that they had committed. So a Drax person said, Drax strives to ensure that the biomass we use and produce delivers positive outcomes for the climate, nature and people across our operations and the communities which neighbour them. We work closely with regulators to establish the best environmental practices. And since 2022, Drax has invested over £100 million on improving and enhancing our pellet plants. And by the end of 2024, we plan to invest a further £30 million on additional improvements. As a condition of our permits, Drax is obligated to regulatory monitor emissions and uses an independent third party to assist in reporting the data to our North American regulators. We can do better, and we are making progress in raising standards and improving our processes. Drax will continue to work closely with regulators and local communities. Thanks very much to Camille Corcoran and Bertie Harrison-Broninski for their time. As usual, there's further reading on our podcast blurb, where you can find links to land and climate review investigations we've discussed, as well as links to previous podcasts with experts on the issues of biomass and BECCS. You can also go to our Land and Climate website, which has additional research and information on the subject. Thanks to Vasko Kostovski for audio engineering the show, and we'll be back in 2 weeks' time with another interview. Thanks for listening.